Has Russia achieved any of its war objectives in Ukraine? It's 3 months since Vladimir Putin launched his so-called special operation. Is the continued conflict complicating efforts to find a diplomatic solution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. 3 months into Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the invasion appears to be turning into a drawn-out war. Thousands have been killed, millions are homeless, many communities are in ruins. Leaders from both sides say they're far from any talk of a ceasefire. Ukraine's president is warning of a bloodbath as Russian forces intensify operations in the east and the south. Volodymyr Zelensky demanded even tougher Western sanctions to send a message to the Kremlin that brute force will not prevail. Germany's energy minister says the European Union is closing in on an agreement for an embargo on Russian oil. And a Russian diplomat has resigned in protest. Boris Bondarov says he's ashamed of what he calls the warmongering, lies, and hatred by Russia's foreign ministry. Zain Basravi reports from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv.
The war in Ukraine has not gone as expected. Kyiv was meant to fall to Russian invaders in a matter of days. 3 months after missiles, shells, and paratroopers began landing in and around the capital, Ukraine is putting the spoils of war on display. Morale and anger at Russia are now so high, Ukrainians say the only acceptable victory will be taking everything back. Occupied territories in the east, even Crimea.
Yes, I believe the return of our territories is possible, and I think we should not stop. I believe there should not be any negotiations about returning to the same borders we had before the start of this war. No, we should get our cities and Crimea back. This is our sovereign country, and we should defend it.
The truth is on our side. We are defending our land. We really want and hope for this to happen.
Yes, Ukraine needs weapons, and our army will do everything, and we will win. I'm sure.
There was less optimism when all-out war came to Ukraine on February 24th. Russian President Vladimir Putin's so-called special military operation was the biggest assault on a European state since World War II. The UN estimates at least 14 million people have been displaced so far, at least 6 million to neighboring countries. When missiles hit a Ukrainian army base in Yavoriv near the border with NATO member Poland, it was the furthest Russian attack in the west of the country. The siege of Mariupol, so violent, it wiped the city off the map, leaving little doubt as to how far Russia was willing to go to achieve its aims. Unable to penetrate Ukrainian defenses around the capital, Russia's withdrawal from Bucha revealed civilian killings that Ukraine described as war crimes. The invasion did change the map, but not perhaps as Putin had hoped. Finland and Sweden applying to join NATO stands to more than double the alliance's border with Russia. Just weeks ago, Independence Square was under lockdown and covered in snow. Now people line up to buy stamps commemorating a moment in the early days of the war, when Ukraine, in no uncertain terms, told Russia to leave its territory.
I hope that it's a good sign that we can win in this war and we can survive. So for me, it's a sign that we have a chance for a good future.
Things look very different in the Ukrainian capital today. Diplomatic missions are reopening, people are returning, and Ukrainians seem far more optimistic, albeit cautiously, than they did at the beginning of this war.
But the war is not over. Russian forces are escalating offensives in Ukraine's east, remobilizing forces to battlefields in the south. All indications are conflict with Russia is the new normal. And as long as Russia controls the skies over their country, nowhere in Ukraine is completely safe. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests in Lviv, in Western Ukraine. Dmytro Shulga, European Program Director at the International Renaissance Foundation. In London, Domitilla Sagromoso, senior lecturer in security and development in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babich, political analyst at the InoSMI Internet Media Project. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining the program today. Dmytro, let me start with you. Is the war essentially at a stalemate now? Has this basically become a war of attrition at this stage?
It is an active phase. It is a war of attrition, but at the same time, it is not like a blitzkrieg. It's already a third month, actually end of the third month, and there is no end of the war in sight. So it's like, it's more like World War I, maybe, in terms of pace. Now what we are having in the eastern Ukraine, where the major fighting is going on.
Dmitry, has Russia achieved any of its objectives in Ukraine, and where do things stand militarily right now from the Russian perspective?
Well, I can give you a perspective which is shared by many Russians, but which I also read, for example, in Junge Welt, the German magazine where Oskar Lafontaine, a very well-known German politician, gave his assessment of the situation. And it was very popular in Russia. He thinks that there were actually three stages. The first stage was the NATO expansion, which was one of the reasons for the war. The second was Putin's decision to invade in February this year, which was the second stage. And now we have the United States getting involved more and more, sending a huge amount of weapons, allocating $40 billion on the aid for Ukraine, which shows that the United States doesn't want it to be another Afghanistan. They want it to be an active war in which Russia would lose. As for Russia's goals and their achievements, part of them were achieved because, Crimea was deblocked. Now water is coming to Crimea from the Ukrainian territory. Basically, Kherson, which is an important city in the south, was taken. Mariupol was taken after a lot of fighting. However, Russians have not achieved one of their main goals, and that was to move the front line away from Donetsk, which is a huge megapolis and which continues to be bombarded by the Ukrainian artillery. So part of their aims were achieved, part of them were not. And of course, there was no regime change in Kiev, which was probably one of the initial goals. That's why the Russian troops tried to move towards Kiev from the Belarusian territory. They retreated now, so this story of a regime change, swift regime change, we can say that this is empty.
Domitilla, how much is the continued conflict complicating efforts to try and find a diplomatic solution?
Well, I think at the moment there isn't really a very strong diplomatic initiative. I mean, there were a few proposals that were brought forward, for example, by the Italian government, but they also envisaged, for example, that there would be a retreat of Russian forces from the areas that they have occupied in Ukraine. And I think that is probably not going to happen. So I think that at the moment, there is a much higher chance that the fight will continue with great intensity. And only either if one of the two sides decides that they want to sort of give up and plea for some kind of diplomatic solution, or both sides after quite some time feel that they need to reach some kind of, that they have reached a sort of hurting stalemate, and they decide to sort of reach some kind of ceasefire agreement. But I really don't think that we are there now. I think both sides seem very determined to continue with the fight. And I think because, as was explained, the objectives were not achieved. Russia has not been able to defeat the Ukrainian armed forces, which is one of the main objectives. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are still, fighting hard to make sure that they dislodge the Russian occupiers from the areas of the east and the south. So I think this is going to be a war that's going to take quite some time still. And I think that any diplomatic efforts at the moment are not going to see any results. So that I'm not very optimistic on that front, but it's also understandable.
Dmytro, where does Ukrainian public opinion stand when it comes to the possibility of some kind of a potential diplomatic solution? And also in the early stages of the conflict, it was being reported that perhaps President Zelensky might be amenable to giving up some territory or possibly to agree to neutrality for Ukraine. If that were to happen, would the public support that?
No, but it's definitely a mood in Ukraine that we cannot compromise our territorial integrity and we cannot compromise our sovereignty. There are so much human losses, losses of human life. There are so much losses of. There's so many atrocities have become known, what Russians are committing on the temporary occupied areas of Ukraine. So it is absolutely non-negotiable to compromise with Russians and to agree on some sort of, partitioning of Ukraine or something like this, or give up some land or something like this. Absolutely not. And it's definitely no support for, no appetite for seeking some sort of ceasefire agreement, which, like what has been done in 2014, 2015, when basically there was an agreement, so-called Minsk agreement, when there was a ceasefire and Russians basically haven't fully implemented the ceasefire and they haven't withdrawn their forces from the temporary occupied areas. And then later they now just basically used the temporary occupied Crimea and temporary occupied Donbas area to launch a larger scale attack on Ukraine. So that's why we understand that what we need is really to have such an agreement where precondition would be first for Russians to withdraw their forces and to accept that they should restore Ukrainians' territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's clear now that Russians are not there, so that's why I agree. Russians are not accepting this now, and they are not ready to withdraw their forces. So that's why basically the war continues, because Russians started this invasion and they want to continue this invasion. They want to put their terms on Ukraine, which is unacceptable. Ukraine is basically doing its self-defense. We are defending our country, and there is no compromise on our territorial integrity or sovereignty.
Dmitry, from your vantage point, obviously diplomatic efforts have failed thus far. Do you think that they could pick up again at some point? And do you think that there is the potential to have President Putin and President Zelensky meet at some point, perhaps face to face?
Well, as to the meeting face to face, we heard a very belligerent statement from President Zelensky just recently, a few hours ago, which means basically, Zelensky said that he would only meet with Putin, no one else, and that he will only talk about a total withdrawal of Russian troops. That means that this meeting is not going to take place anytime in the near future because the positions of the sides are too different. I would say that Zelensky changed his position many times during the first days of the Russian onslaught on Kiev. We remember how Zelensky said that neutral status could be acceptable and could be negotiated. And then the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul basically again talked about non-membership in NATO and neutral status as possible solutions. But then the Ukrainians just withdrew their, their proposal. Well, they changed their position, in fact. So this was the reason why negotiations did not restart, I think. As for the positions of the two sides, I respect Dmytro's opinion. I think he's right on it, but I would kind of advise our viewers to read the Minsk agreements. They were signed in 2015 at the moment when Ukrainian army was basically losing against the militia in Donetsk and Lugansk. And the main points in these agreements was, one of the points was about giving a special constitutional status to the Russian-speaking regions in the east. That was not done. The second was about lifting the blockade. Mr. Poroshenko, then president of Ukraine, imposed a total blockade on Donetsk and Lugansk. There was no food for them, no water, no electricity, no pensions. So basically, Russia accuses Ukraine of not having fulfilled the Minsk agreements. And the word Russia, if you look at the Minsk agreements, was not mentioned there once. The agreement said that all foreign troops should be removed from Ukraine. But that is not only Russian troops. We know that the British were building up basically their base near Charkov in the south of Ukraine. They said it was a training center, but no one could check this training center. So it was basically a mini base. American warships were in the Black Sea all the time, so the reason why Putin decided to act the way he did, a lot of people in Russia do not support it openly. The reason why he acted the way he did was because he could not, in his opinion, allow more bases of NATO countries on the territory of Ukraine. And he was afraid that the situation would finally slip out of control as more and more Ukrainian fighters were trained by American and British instructors. More and more weapons were flooding Ukraine, especially in the 2 months before February 24th, when Putin made his announcement. And look, I mean, Russia cannot dislodge the Ukrainian army from Donbass. So if Ukrainian army attacked when Russian army was still in Russia, if they attacked, they would, of course, they would have crushed
Dmitry,
the Donetsk militia,
Dmitry,
and they would have won the war.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're starting to run out of time. Let me pick up on one of the points you were making in just a moment with another question. Domitilla, so Germany is saying that the European Union is likely going to agree to an embargo on Russian oil imports within days. What kind of impact do you think that's going to have? Is that something that would automatically weaken Russia?
I'm of the view that the sanctions are weakening very much the Russian economy, and that is part of the objective. It's not really regime change, as is often mentioned. It's actually really to weaken the sort of the capacity of the Russian economy to sustain the military conflict. So I think it's very important to continue with these sanctions, even though there isn't maybe an immediate change of the actions of Russia on the ground. And I think it will have an impact, definitely, because Russia is relying very much on selling oil and gas to Western markets and to Europe in particular, as far as gas is concerned, and also oil. So, and the prices are much higher. So when Russia has to sell its energy products to other consumers in the East or globally, they tend to buy now at lower prices. So Russia certainly is losing out. And I mean, it's also going to be a cost maybe for the global energy market. So of course there is a cost to be paid as a result of these sanctions. But from the European perspective, I think there is increasing agreement that this is the right approach, that we can't be fighting, Russia in Ukraine and at the same time become sort of one of the main purchasers of its energy products. So I think that this consensus at the level of the European Union is increasingly being reached. It will take a bit of time, but I think that that's probably where we are heading.
Dmytro, the US, the EU, they have imposed lots of sanctions against Russia thus far. President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have said that more sanctions need to be imposed. From your perspective, have the sanctions that have been imposed thus far actually had their intended effect? Have they acted as a deterrent?
You see, I mean, just first of all, to react to what Dmitry just said, because it's fake news, what he said about NATO's bases in Ukraine, on Ukraine's territory. There was no permanent NATO bases anywhere in Ukraine. And generally speaking, Ukraine until 2014 was a very pacifist country with military virtually non-existent, with no public support for NATO membership at all. Since 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine aggressively, absolutely ungrounded, took part of its territory, Crimea and part of Donbass. Of course, Ukraine had to build up its military, and of course, Ukraine had to seek support and cooperation with other, first of all, with NATO, which is able to provide military support. And actually, if we look from that perspective, it is actually Russian leadership. It is Putin who is putting Ukraine, forcing Ukraine to move to NATO, because NATO seeks protection from Russia. By the way, the same way as now Sweden and Finland, which realized that they need to have protection from Russian aggression.
Dmitry, you were talking about NATO a few moments ago. Dmytro was just talking about NATO. That obviously plays a role in all this. I mean, President Putin did not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. But now you have Finland and Sweden that have applied to join NATO. And there are many analysts who suggest that NATO is in a stronger position now than it was 3 months ago. Did President Putin actually foresee that Finland and Sweden might apply to join NATO if this course of action were taken in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I would like to make some corrections, precisions on what I just said. Because Dmytro said that I said there were NATO bases on the territory of Ukraine. No, there were bases, training centers organized by the United States and Britain. Formally, they were not NATO bases, but de facto, Ukraine was becoming a NATO member because there were American instructors and there were foreign specialists, foreign military on the territory of Ukraine everywhere since 2014 and even before that. As for your question about Finland and Sweden, I mean, look at the news in the Western media. There were dozens of military exercises in which Finnish and Swedish troops participated together with NATO troops. And they were all against Russia. So Russia, of course, is not happy about Finland and Sweden no longer being neutral countries. But I think in the end, this is first of all a blow to the image of Europe. You know, Europe was a peaceful continent with many neutral countries. Now there is just one left, Switzerland. And even Switzerland is not neutral completely. You know,
Dmitry, I'm so sorry to interrupt you again, but we're almost out of time, and I just want to ask Domitilla one last question here. Domitilla, we have about 30 seconds left. Is there any member of the international community that you think can offer an off-ramp to President Putin that he would deem acceptable?
I think in a way that's not an adequate question, because I think that Putin should not be offered a ramp to save his face. I think it's very important to send a clear message by the international community to Russia and other members that these kind of military aggressions to neighboring countries are completely unacceptable, and that these sort of situations are not going to be accepted globally in the future. They have destabilized the European continent. They have created a lot of distress, human casualties and brutality inside Ukraine. There's serious problems globally in terms of supplies of food and fertilizers, for example. The prices of energy also skyrocketed. There are problems which we haven't really discussed around the blockage of the export of products of Ukraine through the Black Sea. And this is creating, as I said, a rise in food products. So all these elements which now have serious global implications, and now there are discussions among the United Kingdom and Lithuania as to whether do something to deblock the Black Sea and the access of Ukraine so that it can export its products, because it's really having serious global repercussions to the global economy at a time when the economy was already trying very slowly to recover from the impact of COVID. So I think that at the moment, the emphasis should be on trying to help Ukraine to really reduce Russia's military presence in Ukraine as much as possible, and see if some kind of agreement can be reached that results in Russia's withdrawal. At the moment, the only actor that could maybe put pressure on Russia is, of course, China. But China seems not at the moment ready to sort of put pressure on Russia to reach some kind of agreement on retreat, and instead is playing a sort of a game of sort of support in terms of political understanding of the position of Russia, and in a way sort of providing, you know, the the markets that Russia needs for the export of many of its energy products. So I really don't see a possibility of any sort of immediate negotiated solution, and let alone one that would allow Putin to sort of save his face and a sort of a ramp off. Thank you.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Dmytro, Shulga, Domitilla, Sagromoso, and Dmitry, Babich. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.